these readings, because it seems like some of the analysis that Yigal has just encapsulated is something which takes out a quarter of my own presentation, but that's good, because I wasn't aware of what it always bears repeating. I've been engaged with this work now, this Kavirajamarga, for about 2 years in a very strange way. I guess nothing like what Sarah and Gil here, who have been doing it methodically and in the more traditional sense of reading the text. I've just been part of a kind of collaboration of sorts, a friendly collaboration with a colleague, a scholar who's been visiting our university, but also who I've visited myself, and we've been having these Skype sessions. And it's just basically it was a way for me to deepen my knowledge of the Alankara Shastra. And also it was from the point of view of Professor Sundaram, R.V. Sundaram, who many of you know, who was really engaged with this work and has been engaged with Sarah and Gil and working on it. He wanted to provide a good Kannada commentary, as well as if anything, a rudimentary English translation of it, which is where I came into the picture, and we were working on it together. So this is where this project has developed with us. So maybe since I'll have a lot of time and less content and more just sort of just showing a few things, I thought I would, I think Sarah did some of this and basically attributed a lot of it that everybody's read Sheldon Pollock, so everyone assumes to know what this text is, but maybe I'll just give a few details about it just to remind everybody. It is what people say is they call it the first extant work of Kannada, and I think Sarah's complicated that picture, and of course that's there. And even though we often think of it as a work of poetics, largely because of the intersections of chapter 2 of Dandin and chapter 3 of this text. This text is in 3 chapters. It's also, of course, a work of grammar. The entire second chapter is heavily linked with what we would call grammar, prosody, history. Chapter 1 and chapter 2 is history and geography, and what the local might mean. You know, these are the kinds of articulations of that this work is a complex, hybrid, heterogeneous work in this way. And it's important to know that this is the first work in world history, probably, to address literary culture from a regional perspective. And that's what's really interesting, I guess, about it in a lot of ways. And it also, in addition to introducing existing Kannada literary forms, not only the literature that precedes it, perhaps sometimes in a negative way, but also the genres, Chattana and Bedande and all these things that Professor Rao mentioned. It also gives a spatial orientation of where this literary Kannada is spoken and used. And this is what's really interesting for a lot of people, the fact that there's a region attached to this language. But what Srivijaya tells us is that, of course, he begins with a kind of a framing Kannada by saying that Sanskrit and Prakrit are well-established languages, and that it is easier to create poetry in these languages. But that creating poetry in Kannada, he says, requires you to collect pieces from here and there. So he gives a whole kind of sense of what the project is. And he says that in order to do this project of creating literature in this language, you have to turn to the best treatises of the tradition. This is what he uses these words. And train. Otherwise, he says, literature can be confused with anything else that one might say and use. So this is the famous example of, it's like animals who indiscriminately eat grass and plants and fodder. They can't distinguish between them. So this is part of his aim, to identify what this is. And thus you have to then go to the history of Sanskrit and Prakrit, Bana. He mentions Kalidasa, Bharavi, Magha, not Dandin, Narayana, Gunasuri. He mentions Kannada poets, perhaps, or there might be Prakrit authors. It's unclear who he's mentioning. And he says that if one does all of these things, that even the Kannada poet can become a master of poetry in their own right, in their own right. So there's a kind of drawing into this culture of becoming a literary person. And this is the case that probably had never been made before, that Kannada could now enter into a world like this. So part of Srivijaya's project is then to identify and promote admissible speech and poetic forms that can be consolidated into a standard literary Kannada. And this, I think, Andrew had brought up in his example the other day, that it seems to be a big question in Srivijaya's day of how one should use Sanskrit and Kannada compositions. And his basic answer seems to have been that you shouldn't use it directly. You shouldn't mix compounds with Sanskrit and Kannada words. You should first transform the Sanskrit into Kannada words and expressions by making all the appropriate phonological and morphological changes, and then one should use them. One should borrow vibhakti, case relationships, and that sort of thing, and sandhi, but one should make them fit a Kannada usage. So he has a whole kind of formula, or a whole explanation of what one should do in transforming the language from Kannada into Sanskrit. Sanskrit into Kannada, that makes it acceptable to then bring into a literary world. He also, when it comes now to Dandin, and this is what's the focus of what I'll say a few words about. I have a long introduction here about the Kavirajamarga, but I'm just sort of drawing out a few of these details to get to what's relevant to our purpose here, is that he begins with dosha, similar to Dandin, but then he gives primacy to Shabdalankara, and that might be, and this is the whole second chapter, is almost solely devoted in the Kavirajamarga. And this is probably because what he's dealing with is really an oral tradition in a lot of ways, and he's drawing out a lot of the flaws. The second chapter draws out a lot of the flaws in sort of structural and stylistic dosha with Shabda. So he emphasizes meters and alliteration. In fact, he has 40 verses just on the sound effects, on Shabdalankara, which he is really technically going into. And some of these I'll give in the final examples that I've given, just because it's not necessarily the kind of correspondences that are interesting for our purposes with Dandin, but just to get a flavor of what kind of sort of poetic consciousness he brings to it. He has a lot of very fascinating imagery, and all these particular expressions to explain what the flaws are like, and these are kind of very clever and very nice to look at. And the other thing, which I won't deal with here, but he does in chapter 2, which is very important, of course, is this, how he takes Dandin's notion of marga. And this is a really fascinating, because, of course, Dandin he posits two, the sort of eastern and the southern, right? There's Vaidarbhi and Gaudi. And somehow, and in a very interesting way, and this is a topic maybe of another conversation, the way in which Srivijaya maps the Uttara and the Dakshina, there's this southern and northern marga alongside of these, and how it fits and doesn't fit, and what the difficulties that Dandin faces, and in conceptualizing this perhaps, and what Srivijaya is sort of facing similar kinds of difficulties, but also the same kind of aspirations to do something with this kind of conceptualizing of styles, and what is how to classify what's actually poetic practice is like. So this is a really fascinating correspondence between Dandin and Srivijaya, but that is, I'm holding back on this. One thing which I did find interesting, and this is what Yigal sort of impressed upon us about the flexibility of Dandin, this kind of ability to keep things open, is you have in the 50th verse in the second chapter of Kavirajamarga, he says that is that even though these ways, these marga, are difficult to conceptualize because there's so many components to them, there's so many things that you have to fit together to make them make sense, that they're beyond a reach of word and mind, he says. But still he's going to do it. He's going to try to do something with it. So I think there's some maybe understanding, maybe he understands Dandin to be like this. He understands what Dandin is doing, and he's sort of taking on that project also because he finds it very valuable. So I think that was kind of an interesting way of maybe just drawing that out. So what I'll do is just go through a sets of some of these examples from chapter 3. I've identified about four types, just typologies maybe, of things where we can see some of the differentiation of how Kavirajamarga is. I mean, we can begin with the fact that these are definitely close texts and that one is reading. But when we talk about translation, we're probably, that's a very complex thing. I mean, it would be false to think of it as a kind of translation in the most kind of simplistic sense, and yet the types of translational consciousness that Sri Vijaya brings to his work vis-a-vis Dandin is really what's fascinating and what's really interesting, and draws out perhaps his relationship to Dandin in a larger way, and maybe then gives us models for seeing relationships of others across Asia, as it were, with Dandin. So, following the list cataloged by Dandin and Bhamaha, Sri Vijaya defines 36 primary ornaments, alankaras of sense, the usuals, and another 75 or so subcategories, I think far fewer than what Dandin does, 75 or so subcategories that expand the subtle permutations embedded in these primary tropes. To illustrate the definitions, Sri Vijaya also presents the reader with a number of fine examples of literature. Some 150 of these are directly translated or adapted, whatever we want to use, transcreated from Dandin's Kavyadarsa, and many others are newly composed by Sri Vijaya himself. So these definitions serve at least two ends. First, like Dandin's work, they explicate poetry and its conventions to experienced or prospective poets and audiences. And the second, perhaps echoing the chord struck in the first chapter of the Kavirajamarga, where you have this kind of intervention of Kannada into a Sanskrit Prakrit world of literature. There's a kind of ways of drawing Sanskrit culture closer to an emerging Kannada literary culture. These are all very simplistic things I'm saying, but this is just to kind of frame what he might be doing here. Sometimes you have very minor, and this is not what I'm going to be dealing with. You have sort of minor differentiations, so certain names of the alankaras are different, or they're altogether left out. For example, Sri Vijaya will list has a samasta rupaka, kind of a compounded metaphor, as a subtype of rupaka, which Dandin does not. Or Dandin will give such an example. You'll call it arupaka, but there won't be that name will be different. Sometimes there are some very small differences in the nomenclature. So the Kavirajamarga has sakala vyapi arthantaranyasa, whereas Dandin has vishwa vyapi arthantaranyasa. So there's a few things like that you can identify in comparing the two, and then some odd inversions. Anyway, so I thought the first thing I would take us through was that first one that I think that Yigal in the question when he was questioning Sarah, are talking about this, how the first that alankara of jati or swabhavokti is dealt with, and I think some of the statements that were made are quite interesting. These are all Yigal's translations, by the way. I asked his permission, so they're out there. For the Kavyadarsa, that there's four different types of these jati, right? They're divided along genera. He calls it actions, attributes, and individual entities. So you can see this first one, and the first example, one sees the most significant outlier, or the most significant difference, is the animal changes, right? You have from the parrot of Dandin to the peacock, And that's sort of the main. I have the note here in the handout, which is not what I wanted to put out there, but this is the different handout. Hold on a minute. This is not the. Okay, that's fine. So the second one with actions, right? The Yigal identifies as the again the animals change from the doves to the animal to the elephant, and but impressively also the sort of the natural state of each of the animal couple's romantic situation is also transformed. So, you know, the dove's rolling eyes are replaced with the elephant's half-closed eyes, and the dove's twirling is replaced by the elephant's sort of ceasing of chewing the leaves, and the kiss of the dove becomes a gentle trunk rub of the elephant. Right? This is an elephant kiss. So these are the kinds of changes he renders there. The next one with the hair. This is the Yigal translation. The hair on my body stand on end. My heart stops. My eyes shut. That's how it feels when my love touches me. And then you can see the Kavirajamarga's translation of this. Intoxication made her eyes close and filled her heart with affection. She was clothed in a layer of stiffening down on her body. Her speech was a lisp. So now this is it's kind of an interesting thing. Of course they sound very similar, and you can say that they're a translation of one of the other. But you see that that here the Kavyadarsa verse is from the point of view of the lover, and it kind of reveals an immediacy of the experiential moment, while simultaneously explaining the sensation of being touched by the beloved. The Kavirajamarga verse, on the other hand, it almost describes the beloved's experience, and it leaves some of the immediacy. It leaves in some of the immediacy of the moment, but then it oscillates between the present moment and then a later a remembrance of that moment. So there's a subtle aesthetic change in the way it's rendered in this particular form with the Kavirajamarga. The final one with I think was discussed. Yigal discussed that you have Shiva and this is just the individual entities are described in terms of the individuated parts or aspects of the particular entity associated with the particular entity. But the big thing that I saw here, the big sort of change, if you will, the differentiation, was that where you have the presence with Shiva, the Kavirajamarga verse is marked because of the absence of the beloved. Right? The beloved is not there anymore. So that's the particular thing being played with there, sort of a presence and absence in addition to anything else that might be there with leaving out Shiva or leaving in Shiva. But of course, everything else is very different in terms of what the tone of these verses are. Okay, so this is just the kind of one kind of translational moment of what we might see in these verses and how these two texts might be interrelated. The second example is a little bit more closer to something that I looked at before with reference to Kavya, and this was just an argument that I had made in terms of the way in which I saw. This was largely based on work of thinking about authors who had worked on the similar processes of how classical Latin works or Latin learning had gradually been integrated or assimilated into regional cultures in Europe, vernacularization, or this process of what they call translatio studii, sort of transfers of knowledge in this big way. And one of the arguments was that that often the regional work, the vernacular, as it were, was not only serving the new creative foundational work was not only serving as a translation of the classical work, the Latin work, but also a commentary on it. And in some ways, it was supplanting, as it were, or coming side by side with what a commentary in Latin would do for the Latin text. So here, in Kavya, we can see this, where you'll see that often the first great works of the regional cultures, which are Kavyas of classical Sanskrit texts, are themselves either aware, or in some cases commentators themselves, but at least aware of having a commentarial consciousness, And in doing so, they then take those techniques of doing commentary and they very effectively and respectfully convert these into a creative mode. And this you can see. And this manifests in many ways. Sometimes it manifests in actually importing actual glosses into a creative work, from that you would see in a commentary into the new work. Sometimes you see it an amplification. You'll see 4 or 5 verses which translate a single verse. Sometimes you'll see a condensation. You'll see 10 verses of the original Sanskrit work being put into one verse in the regional poem. So here I thought there's something similar was happening with this example too in the Kavirajamarga, where here I've flipped it. The first Kavirajamarga verse, the verse in chapter 3, 103 is, "This is the flock of Hamsa birds and not an autumnal cloud. A beautiful sound is heard from the birds, like the chime of anklets." And this, of course, is very similar to the Kavyadarsa verse, which Yigal translates as, "Is this a row of autumn clouds or a flock of white geese? It sounds like the chime of anklets. So no, it can't be clouds." And this, by the way, this alankara is the upamakshepa. So this is the dismissal based on a simile. So this is what you're refuting. The conventionally understood meaning is being dismissed or refuted here. So Sri Vijaya has this verse, and he's taking this from Dundan's verse. Now the next. So that one is clear. But now look at what happens in the next example. And this is an example of I'm sorry? Asamahita, exactly, coincidence. So here's how the Kavyadarsa renders this one verse. "I was lying at her feet trying to appease her anger when luckily a rumbling thunder came to my aid." Okay, it's a nice one. And now these are, what I've seen is that I think that the Kavirajamarga now gives 2 verses to account for this one verse of the Kavyadarsha. The first one is, "When I set out to pacify my beloved, the young moon, which is the crown jewel of the spring season, rose in the sky." So what this verse does is that this first verse replaces Dundan's thunderclap with the moon. The second verse now is, "In the darkest part of the rainy night, I went to meet my angry beloved. In the midst of the thick clouds, a glow of lightning appeared and removed my distress." The second verse somewhat restores the image of the thunderclap by introducing the element of the glow of lightning and the notion of assistance that's found in Dundan's verse, the assistance of the thunder. As the subject imagines the lightning to appear out from the heavy clouds in order to remove my distress, quote unquote, and that's the reference to probably the Abhisarika who goes out at the night to rendezvous with her lover. But while one notices that this example, you see the intertextuality here, what's really interesting here is that the sort of, creatively drawing out Dundan's implicit, what he's implying by this, and actually making it explicit in these 2 verses, but doing it still in a very creative way, in a very respectful way, which is a very kind of it's a very subtle transformation of the original work that he sort of has in his mind, of course. But this is what he's doing with it, and it is a little bit. This is something that we can have a private conversation, but maybe Yigal, I can ask him. But this idea that somehow it's unclear whether it's the time for lovers to be together, which is what's being signaled because of the coming of the monsoon, or if it's as I think you've suggested in your work that it's the distraction, which is actually causing the distress to be removed, the distraction of the thunder. So this is something which is is more of an interpretation question and something to ponder. But both of them are written into Srivijaya's work here. So the third example now of the third kind of translational activity, which you see between these two works, which is interesting, is the Alankara of Nidarshana. Now I think this is probably closer to Sarah's point here, is that the Kavyadarsa gives only two examples of Nidarshana. Right? As soon as the sun rises, it lends luster to lotuses, only to show that the whole point in wealth is to confer it onto friends. And to the touch of lunar rays, the whole dark front dissolves. It bodes a bad ending to the foes of our monarch. Monarch. It's a good one. The Kavyadarsa gives 9 examples of Nidarshana. 9. And all of them are about the king, right, of course, because there's something about Nidarshana and the kind of royal, eulogistic, there's something connected between those two things and this particular Alankara. And so you can see each one of them, but each one of them, of course, now draws us into a whole different kind of it's a different kind of space. We're talking about ministers and kind of a whole kind of niti culture we're drawn into. So, and you can read these on your own if you'd like, or we can go over some of these. But this is the point I just wanted to make is just the expansion in the exemplification here with Nidarshana particularly. The fourth one is probably not particularly worth going over again, because it seems like we've been going over it already, and this is the whole Jina, Vishnu, Hari, Shiva thing. It's like what this is. I didn't have much more to say about this except just to point it out, but that it is I think with what everybody else has been saying, that I think maybe just the paucity of examples where this conversion happens with the Jina, suggests to me that it's that the kind of overlaying too much of a religious element to it is maybe not there, but that's something which has been well argued on all the fronts. So it's worth exploring all of it and really taking it all in slowly. But here, of course, you see the other switch. One thing I should have mentioned with Nidarshana, which I didn't, I'm sorry, is that there are also moments when, in addition to Nidarshana for the king, he also, of course, finds other avenues to bring in the king. And this is what I think was closer to what Sarah was speaking about as well. And this is where you have this last one, this 3.181 is actually the trope of magnanimity. Right? This is the Udara. This is where he also, of course, draws in a similar kind of thing with the Nipatunga, and you get this very fascinating. The flow of ichor from the elephants of running the flow of ichor from the temples of running elephants, sent as a gift by other kings, always fills with mud the grounds of the palace of Nipatunga, the moon in the world of men. This is a very interesting kind of image, which is which I guess brings us closer to this kind of political world that Sarah is speaking of, that this text seems to be very heavily saturated in. Anyway, so that's this is how you see how closely this text is linked with the king. The fifth example, now this is not really much of an example. What I wanted to do with with that fifth section was to show from chapter 2 how there are certain examples in the Kannada which really take you outside of the Kavyadarsa's world. Some of these examples which don't and you don't know whether they're coming from what he's inheriting from a previous, all the literature that he's working with in giving examples, and of course also attempting to refine and give boundaries for it to move forward as a kind of a literary culture on par with Sanskrit and Prakrit. But look at this example that he gives when he's talking about this Shanta Prasa. This is one of these kind of second syllable rhyming is very important types. These 7 types of prasa. And and this is the example that he gives, which is, I just wanted to bring out the example, not so much the lakshana here for this. But he says, climbing onto a wooden plank that appeared unexpectedly, the young girl, who was like a lifeless doll, somehow escaped a pack of crocodiles in the ocean and remained alive. It is a wonder. This doesn't look like anything that you might see in Dandin or anything. It's very, and the text is sort of studded with these kinds of verses here and there as well, which are very interesting to, I think, at least identify, to take us out of the kind of, if one had a very simplistic translational model in place, this takes us out of that altogether. And then there's always these really nice little things when he talks about these little nyayas that he gives in addition, to sort of complement his pointing out of flaws, right? Like, poetry should not be like the mixing of curds with rice paddy. Even if one obtains the desired meaning, if words are strung together in the wrong way, it would be like stringing pearls with pepper seeds. Words that do not fit should be left out. Placing short vowels followed by conjunct consonants between words is akin to laying a heavy burden on the head of a child. An additional adverb, when added to a sentence where a single adverb suffices, is excessive. It is akin to leading a calf to drink from the udder of 2 cows. An unnecessary use of the words early and furthermore. You came early to the great groom-choosing ceremony of the princes. Why blame me? Furthermore, do not bother coming here if you believe the words of fickle-minded men on the streets. These seem very pedestrian kinds of verses, which which are being, from the point of view of it's not Kavya in that sense, An example of an exaggerated type of lovely composition in the northern way. This is your arrival, like a stream of water, washed away all the dirt from my mind. I became the most sacred person on earth. Some of them are very odd kinds of... That has a Dandin complement. Okay, good. I'd like to see this one. An example of using rustic language, which here means saying something too baldly. Bemoaning your absence. I thought about you day and night. As I loudly called out to you, my mind could not tolerate it. You have no mercy. You are a man made of wood. Extraneous words that are part of the initial compound will not be compatible with the rest of the expression, just as the unsweetened tip of the sugarcane is not compatible with the rest of the stalk. And anyway, he has a couple other ones. He says that you shouldn't use archaic words. This is the very famous one that I think is in Shelley Pollack's work as well. That poets that use archaic words in their texts is like is inauspicious. It's like men who have a taste of making love with aged old women. The internal subdivisions are innumerable in the same way that milk and jaggery, which have their own taste, are open to innumerable subdivisions because of individual taste. So these kinds of, I just wanted to kind of that for all of the implantation of a kind of a very close relationship with Dandin, and the kind of also a respectful but very marked attempt to differentiate his work from Dandin's, while also drawing it in, is there. There are also these moments in this work which are just full of these kinds of imagery and explanations in verses which let you know that he's also and that coupled, all these things coupled with his kind of more programmatic statement in that first chapter of this work, where he talks about these are the regions where Kannada is spoken. That Kannada is on par with Sanskrit and Prakrit. If one can become a master of this work, if one does these things. There's a certain kind of demonstration throughout the second and third chapters of what he's sort of identifying in the first chapter as an ideal, or as a kind of the hypothesis of what Kannada could be. And so that's a very interesting thing. And I think just to end on a few, I guess, things that can be discussed is that some of the big differences between these works, perhaps, is that, whereas Dandin, of course, is coming in the middle of maybe a mature tradition already of Kavya, Srivijaya, even though we do know that something is existing before, he's starting a tradition on some level, which is an interesting differentiation of what they're, and one of them is working on almost solely an oral literature. I mean, I guess the inscriptions would complicate this question, but there really isn't a kind of a sense of and maybe that's why the Shabda Alankara and the emphasis on faults in this, Vakya dosha and Shabda dosha and doshas in meter are so heavily emphasized in this work, and really kind of brought out. And then there's perhaps this the regional, like even after identifying the regional aspect of Kavirajamarga in terms of like these specific villages that he mentioned. Right? He mentions 5 or 6 villages and areas, I guess you can call them, that where Kannada is, this standard Kannada is spoken or is used. This importation of marga, of then differentiating what one might think of as, this is what I'm hearing, of course I'm taking this from people who've worked on this work or have thought about it, that this Uttara might refer to a northern Karnataka, whereas the Dakshina is a southern. And so there's even within this region, which has been now mapped, usages, and to what extent that mirrors the Sanskrit, the Dandin's kind of, we don't know if Eastern and Southern, if Vaidarbhi and Gaudi actually represent a real space, or if it's a kind of imagined space that has some, that may have had some more, concrete context in a past time. It's unclear. So, but the fact that he's still that all those complications are brought into this work, I think, is worth contemplating and thinking about. And so that's it.
So, thank you for this. Since I unfortunately don't know Kannada, but it's very interesting. I was hoping you could perhaps reflect a little bit more about the idea. You mentioned you were looking at translatio studi as a certain sort of model, and seeing translation as commentary, which I really like that sort of approach. My question is, especially in these examples where you have the Jati, Swabhavokti examples, what sort of commentary do you see going on? What is it supplementing? What is it adding? What would this process of commentary be? And I'm also thinking specifically of kind of maybe the idea of supplementarity in this.
See, I wouldn't say translation as commentary, just and leave it at that. I mean, this is something which actually Yigal pointed out to me, is that commentaries continue to be written, of course, but for this Kannada audiences, in some level, this would be a commentary as well as something of what Dandin has accomplished or done, right? So it's in some ways it's what's actually carrying on the tradition of Dandin in this particular culture.
And is this how it tends to be, that you'll have something that follows Dandin, so Swabhavokti or Jati, and then you have completely different examples, or do you think they're actually adding to is it adding to Dandin, or is it just providing other sorts of models? Like, what is this process actually? What does it actually look like?
It's a good question. I think at least if I can draw in from what I remember from studying a couple kavyas and seeing this process, it feels like that one of the things is that part of the new example, which has now drawn from not only the Mula Grantha, but also from an understanding of the commentary on that Mula Grantha, is then, when it is then re-instantiated into this new work, there is some awareness of the local context that you're writing this for. And that enters into it sometimes. And the Kavya definitely does. In the changes that you see affected, you see that the changes reflect something of the local that don't undermine what has been what the main gist of the main, the cleverness of the image or the thought, that has been maintained. But sometimes that happens. Sometimes it's just the individual author's own marking of that this is his work. This is not this is not somebody else's work that he's simply parroting, or peacocking. But there's something very unique about. So I think maybe that I guess it shifts back and forth between doing a kind of an idiosyncratic individualistic work, an individualistic act that's being done in this translational process, but also there's an awareness that he's bringing something to somebody. And he's not simply just bringing himself. He's bringing something that he's inherited, that he's studied, he's worked on, that he finds important, and he's bringing it to some other people. And that thought maybe is what produces some of the changes, or at least may give us some way of thinking about what the changes are. That consciousness has to be maybe thought about or brought into it a little bit. That it's not simply a mimicking or imitating or a parroting, nor is it simply a faithfulness, nor is it a neglect. I mean, I guess it's a case-by-case thing. It's just this is what I've just noticed from a few of these examples. There's not enough of this because this is the Shastra. So this is the other thing. You don't really feel like it's not. You don't get the full weight of the translational aspect as you get in a Kavya. Where you can really start seeing what these poets are doing with other poets. Here it's kind of hard.
Well, thank you very much for this fascinating collection of small gems. I've always wanted to read the Kavirajamarga, but I was afraid of the script. And
it didn't stop me. I can't read this.
But I see clearly how you can think regionally in terms of pan-South Indian horizon. And when you were reading in your example 2 section, the KRM 3124, when I set out to pacify my beloved, immediately I thought of the poem, the Sangam poem, which says, Nallei yallei, neluven nilave. You are not good, O long white moon. That means the moon which is there for too long. Because that's a case where the Iravukuri, the night meeting, has to be cancelled because of the moon. I don't know whether this is the same in here for him, but that would be if you read this in a Tamil poem. And then when we went to your section, example 5, when you had an example of a Syrian alliteration, well, immediately I thought, well, I talk about the 20 Varnam. This is the second Varnam. We have Pa Varnam, Ta Varnam, and this is exactly the definition of Ta Varnam, which in Tamil would be Ta Varnam, Idait Vanda, Yedugate Agum. So he must be conversant with that. And then I thought, are you aware that in the commentary to the first Karigay of Yaparungala Karigay, we have a number of references to treatises. And Anne Monius has mentioned the reference to the Rupavatara, but we also have reference to other works. And one of them is a Kannada work, and Kannada work on prosody. So he refers to Gunagangyam ennum Karunataka Sandame. And he's trying to find common point between his treatise and other treatises. So he has some common point with Rupavatara, which is the use of Mudaninaipu. And he has some common point with that Kannada metrical treatises, which is the use of female adjective. And he has other common point with other treatises. So you imagine the regional, you have poets from the north and from the south. They communicate with each other. Some of them are bilingual. And so it makes sense to say that there are several margas which are regional. I don't know whether this is what Dindin had in mind, but in the Kannada Tamil context, it makes sense.
It's also very interesting, this, because there's different kinds of course, this on metrics, on this prasa. This Shanta prasa is the generic one, but there's 6 other ones which Nagaraja Rao could tell us more about the different kinds of prasa. But that might be another stream of what this work is interacting with, and other sets of works and texts on metrics and prosody.
When you interpret the guna in terms of varnam, that's what you do. You can do it for some of them, not for all. For some it's easy, for others probably difficult.
Well, when you can look at the whole work, I think you'll be able to identify it, because this translation will be out soon enough, and you'll be able to see all the technical details of prasa and see how that works.
Thanks, Deven. This is wonderful, and it brings the text to our discussion in a very lively way. I want to make a comment on the slide that is now up there on the Nidarshana, because it's particularly fascinating in connection with the Sarah's talk as well. So this is a question of what are these alankaras and how they keep changing from text to text. So if you remember Bhama's example of Nidarshana, it's an example of a negative example. That is to say, the sun sets only to teach to teach a lesson that everything that rises must also fall. So the subtext seems to be that those in power should remember that power, is momentary and things like that. Then Dandin changes this. He keeps the political slant of this, and he changes this to two examples. One is a positive example to one's king, because Bhama is a very savvy court persona. I think, not unlike Bhama, was probably, in my reading of it, not situated in a court. And so the positive example is that the king shares power, shares wealth, circulates the wealth. The sun rises, the lotus open, to show that the whole point in wealth is to confer it on friends. And the negative example is directed to the enemy of the king, right? So that's, you have a good example, you have a bad example, but still there's some utpreksha involved, right? These luminaries, these sun and moon, and then kind of doubles the example of Bhama in many playful ways, but it's still, there's something about the natural behavior of the sun and the moon that is meant to teach us some lessons, attribute to themselves. Now, if you look at this example that you just gave, this fascinating section in the Kavirajamarga, it does many things that are very unusual. First, it expands incredibly upon Dandin, where it usually, if anything, it does a bit shorter sections. So usually there are many less. Usually there are slightly less examples or subtypes here. The text opens up, and it opens up for a kind of a needy teaching about politics that has very little to do with this kind of utpreksha that we see. There are similes, there are parallels, but we're less interested now in what lesson the sun and the moon set out to teach, and more about politics per se. So maybe this Nidarshana is taken to be something else now, as a kind of a purely political lecture for this imperial cultural court setting that produced all the texts that you and Sarah have described.
And yet some of the imagery becomes folksy as well, right? This after being completely absorbed in a task, what is the use about asking its result? That's fine. But then it's like a yokel asking about taking a bath after having his head already shaven clean. It's an interesting juxtaposition of these kinds of, just the tone, and which is also interesting,
It is actually a reflection of a Sanskrit proverb.
Yeah.
Mundita mundao nakshatrani pruchhati.
Yeah.
Which is found in Vishakadatta's drama.
The Mudra Rakshasa.
Yeah.
And can you go back to your example number one? Because I want to come back to the really interesting idea of looking at Kavirajamarga as a commentary.
Oh, example, I see.
Example number one is the one that's on Swabhavokti. So, you just had the standard distinctions that are running through all of them of, jati, kriya, guna, and dravya. One of the things that you start to see in the juxtaposing them together, what Kavirajamarga is helping us to see is that in order to see the swabhava of something, we have to see it in relationship to something else. And so then there's a way in which it's almost as if the categories of kriya and guna are in play here. So that in this of kriya, that the intention of the dove is part of its swabhava. And Kavirajamarga has that in terms of with the elephant. You could say, we think, we're trying to sometimes feel, what is the intention of the author of Kavirajamarga towards Dundan? And we're trying to figure that out. When we move to the one on guna, what we see is, no, this other person outside me does work on me, in which I see that this person is not just like any person, but this is my beloved. And I learned something about myself in the process too. And that's where there's a way in which the commentarial status becomes really quite interesting, in the sense of commentators are both intending to do something towards the text, but also making them open to being transformed by the text. And so we could say that looking for Kavirajamarga as a translation, we're focusing on the swabhava of kriya. When we start to open it up as a commentary, we're starting to see something about the guna of Dundan, that the guna doesn't belong to the lover, it belongs to the beloved. And so we have to figure out, why is it that the beloved has this effect on me? So the way that Kavirajamarga really thematizes this kind of relationality and understanding swabhava is really like brilliant for opening up everything in Dundan. And then the last one is like a brilliant move. That relationality is best understood in terms of not presence, but absence. It's in absence that the relationality is most intense. And you can say, this is echoing in the religious world as well with viraha bhakti and all that. But it also is very, it goes back to our problems of reading, say, things in Java and so on. That we may feel the presence, the relationality of Dundan the most, precisely in the places where it's very hard to see.
And if I can go further, just on all these lines, just for fun, it seems like it's interesting that the change from the dove to the elephant is interesting, because the dove is, of course, it's presented as kind of very active and twirling and moving and kind of this kind of energy, whereas the elephant is this very, his action is actually a kind of ceasing of action. It's kind of a slow. Just a settling, right? The elephant is just settling and kind of leaving his activity behind in order to enjoy in this kind of romantic situation, whereas the dove's romance is all about this very hectic activity. It's an interesting.
The other
this
thing
is
that I
taking
would
your
say that
thread further.
Kavirajamarga shows to us is how each example, when it follows the other, shows us something that was in the previous one that is emerging from it, so that we go from the general, in which the singular emerges from the general, as we move from jati to dravya. And it's a very kind of brilliant insight of what's going on and, swabhavukti.
Another point about swabhavukti here is, you have to note that some authors like Udbhata, they were very particular that in the case of Swabhavokti, only the natural activities of some animals should be depicted, not of the human beings. Kasyachin mrigadimbadehe, that is the word Udbhata uses. But Dandin did not accept it. He gave an example of the parrot as well as a human being. Like that, in the Kavirajamarga also, there is the peacock, there is the elephant, but afterwards we also see the human beings that they are being described. Their actions can also be the subject of Swabhavokti. And so if Udbhata had reached Nrupanga's court. He is ignoring him and accepting the way of Dandin.
We only have about 5 minutes left, so maybe we'll take Larry, Whitney, and Sarah, and then make some comments.
This is again on the question of in what ways this can be read as a commentary, and I address this to you, but I think it applies to all of the non-Sanskrit adaptations, or whatever we're going to call them, of Kavyadarsa. It seems to me the absolutely crucial question is how much does Srivijaya expect his readers to have an active familiarity with Dandin? That's to say, if he doesn't presuppose that, you could read the Svabhava examples and you get to the last one, and the fact that he's replaced Shiva with the beloved, whether it's present or absent, can be avoiding a potentially controversial religious topic, but it doesn't actively present itself to the reader as a remark on Dandin, where if the reader is presupposed to have Dandin in his or her mind, then you go through the first 3 examples, which are topically similar, even if they adapt in important ways, not as examples, and then you get to the last one, and it's like a slap in the face almost, right? It's a pointed comment on what Dandin has done, and I think that with this text or any of these texts, it seems like an absolutely key question is how much is the author presuming that his readers will be comparing him with Dandin and noting the similarities and differences and seeing, aha, this reveals something that isn't there in Dandin and should be, or it clarifies something that's obscure. I don't know if you could address
It feels like chapters 1 and 2 of Kavirajamarga probably doesn't anybody doesn't need to have knowledge of Dandin. In this one, I wonder if both could be at play, right? Where you would have a certain layer of audience which would obviously get great pleasure in seeing the changes being made, the Sanskrit scholars, and then others would almost be introduced. He's like the Abhinava Dandin, right? He would be the new Dandin, and that they would have to take him as the face, as the first, as the initiator. And I'm wondering if that logic applies everywhere in this. Is that the commentary may deepen somebody, or even like the regional Kavya or whatever, some kind of commentary, even in another language, might deepen the experience for those who already know the original, but it might just introduce it on a kind of more, in a less intense level for those who, that's how I would understand it, I guess.
I'm just going to piggyback on this, because I was also interested in the replacement of the Kante Kala Kapalena verse. I was wondering, maybe looking this up with Sarah's paper, and thinking about the kind of bigger discursive context of the production of this text. You guys mentioning the Niti section, or what seems to be this kind of imposed Niti section, kind of helps with that. Because I saw this, I've always been fascinated by that move on Dandin's part, this kind of, this radical and kind of very counterintuitive move about Dravya moving into this kind of mythological register. And I see this as kind of this stereotype, but good stereotype, this kind of bluff, plain-speaking Kannadiga sensibility, that it's like bringing it back to the kind of, to the real, to this real kind of domestic scene. I don't know if that, I actually really like what Charlie said about the idea of seeing these as a series, as a progression. I guess so this is just, I wanted to do the Dandin effect in the room and see if other people, starting with you, Deven, whether you actually feel that there's something to that. Is there, as Larry's suggesting, maybe this bit of, is there this critical Philip that's supposed to be there? And is there some way we can say there's something wider? Can we link that up with a wider thing in the text? The only and there's one other thing that maybe, because it's on the same page, we can link that together. You meant with the Chakita, the verse about the thunder, the Samahita verse. What I think is interesting there, and again, I'd be interested to know what you and others think about this, is the first of those verses about the moon. It seems like what happens is it kind of, I see it as almost this kind of domesticating thing. It brings it into rasa talk, because it kind of, there's this Udipana Vibhava that appears, and that kind of sets so it's making a different point. Whereas, and then he resumes the other, the major message coming from of coincidence, as you said, from the Dandin source.
Well, you could see it as removing or sort of dividing the potential ambiguity in Dandin. You suggested that the thunder could be, it's the rainy season and we should get together, or she's
distracted,
afraid,
or afraid,
or distracted. And you could see the Kavirajamarga's 2 examples as taking each path. Right.
Yeah, and the other thing that I think what you were just saying, and I think I lost my thought here, but there was that that if we think about this, the educative aspect of Kavya to non-readers, and maybe what you're saying that by introducing the more kind of domesticated or common example of the moon and that sort of thing, sort of you're almost kind of introducing the Kavisamayas of Kavya in a way that is, and then that can actually then expand into a further, more complex, reworking of that basic trope. So that could be another. But who knows? I mean, it's endless. I mean, the fact is that it's not. He's not giving us a commentary. He's not talking about it in a shastra. He's just giving us his own creative world. So it's whatever we can gather from it.
We have one question, very, very quickly.
Is this on? So I love your idea of this as functioning as a sort of commentary, and I think that's really important given that in Old Kannada there really aren't any commentaries, and so these texts stand in for entire traditions, and so just in that comment, it makes me think about reading Pampa Bharata, and I think Pampa Bharata is doing something quite similar, and the Karnataka Kadambari, I think we could read it like that. So I think that's incredibly productive, particularly in light of the absence of commentary. I'm just curious, and this is just a completely improvisational question, but you have a very interesting relationship to Kannada that's a sort of very distinct perspective of intimacy, but also distance. And so I'm wondering, David said something that I've been kind of rolling over in my mind of some of the most important things about literary theory never get formulated and never get stated. And so as you're reading the Kavirajamarga, are there features of the text that you see as doing literary theoretical work that Srivijaya never actually specifies?
Wow.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. I'll be quick. Yeah, I'll give a very quick thought. But that second part, my relationship to this is actually, I think maybe the reason why it is the way it is because I don't know enough yet. I don't know. I haven't read Srivijaya in the language yet, so I'm just working from a very almost like a distant reader, reading and just looking at it and just trying to see what makes sense to me. And Kavyadarsa, I would say I've gone halfway to what everybody else has gone. I mean, everybody is intimate with that text. I'm still distant from that work as well, and so maybe that's one of the reasons why I'm just sort of looking back and kind of almost like the exercise we did yesterday with Utpreksha, where you're just looking at a bunch of material and seeing what's happening. The first part was interesting. What did you ask the first thing you asked?
It was just a comment. We can talk about it.
No, but it was interesting because I had something to say about that. But
Well,
I'll stop.
We'll resume here at 11:30.
Okay. Thank you.